Hey, what's up, guys? So, you might be wondering how to read battle reports. I'm gonna kind of give you a whole blatant bliss of mess, like just a lot of things that I've been digging into, and it's a fun thing to talk about. All right, so when you're wanting to read a report, the one thing you need to know is infantry are going to be in the front, lancers are going to be in the middle, and the marksmen are going to be in the back. Typically, whenever you're doing a solo, right? If you solo somebody, widgets don't apply. But if you like rally a fort, widgets apply. Knowing where widgets apply and when they don't apply is a pretty important thing. Widgets typically follow suit with being on base. But, at the same time, right? If you say attack a player at their base, the 20% boost that you get for troop attack does apply. So it's a little tricky to kind of understand the math behind some of this stuff, but we'll get into it. And so, one thing that you might notice whenever you're sending solos or if you're hitting rallies is that lancers can still hit marksmen even though they're in the middle, and marksmen can still hit infantry even though they're in the back. But infantry can't hit anything. They just soak damage until eventually the infantry line is gone, and then they start doing a stupid amount of damage once they hit lancers. Okay. So when you're wanting to compare, like in a report, for example, like, okay, why am I winning or losing? You kind of have to think in terms of, okay, what counters what? So infantry countering lancers, lancers countering marksmen, and marksmen countering infantry. You got to get into this mindset of, okay, is my inf attack higher than my opponent's inf attack? Is my inf attack better than their lancer defense? If it's not, chances are you're going to lose. So the general rule of thumb here is pay attention to this. And then when you're looking at those counter stats, you also have to take in consideration of special bonuses. And if you haven't really caught on to this, there's kind of a little rule of thumb. And we'll get into this a little bit, but basically, let's say, for example, if I know, and this is one of those problems that we have right now that I'm trying to solve, and I'll show you what I mean here in a minute. But like, let's say, for example, I go out and I attack somebody, and I know what my core stats is. I can tell you with some certainty, okay, that this is the equation that basically all you need to use to be able to do it. Okay, so if we scroll down here a little bit, let's say for a moment your core stat for an attack stat, right? Again, if you're wondering how do I find what that core stat is, all right, whenever you go out to attack somebody, you tap on this little arrow here. This is what your core stats are. So like in my case, it's 534, but in this particular equation, let's say it's 541.6. Okay. You're wondering what's this 25 in reference? Well, what we're doing is we're taking the actual troop bonus that we're going to get from our buff, which is to say that if you took the 20% attack buff that you're going to get using the troop attack bonus, right, for 12 hours, you're going to get 20%. Okay, that's where 20% of that's going to come from. Now, if you're wondering where the 5's coming from, the 5% is actually for a rally buff, right? And that's assuming you had it. Of course, not everybody gets a 5% rally buff, but let's just say for a moment that it was 5%, right? Then all you would do is take those two buffs, which is the rally attack buff and the troop attack buff. You put the two together, which that 5% attack buff, by the way, this applies on exclusives more specifically, right? That is to say, you get a 15% buff whenever you use somebody like Mia or if you use Geronimo. That's where this buff is coming in. That's why I'm using it as an example. But let's say for a moment it was 5 and not 15, right? Then you would just take 25, which is to say basically take the number of percent that you're getting here, add that onto your total of whatever it is that you have for a core stat for, like in this instance, infantry attack, right? And you're going to take that 546.1, add 25 to it, and then you're just going to take 541.6 times 0.25 You're going to take those two numbers and you're going to get 702%. Believe it or not, that should, whenever you're going around and attacking, that should match the attack buff that you get for infantry. Now, inversely, because you know what your core stat is, which is 541.6, you could also, okay, let's say you want to backtrack and figure out how did we get to 541.6. Well, in theory, what you can do is actually backtrack this a little bit. And this is where I was thinking, well, perhaps there's a way we could actually figure out what an enemy's core stat is. Because, well, more or less, we already know how to get to the core stat to, buff stat ratio, which is to say your final destination, for your stat bonus. So if you take that number and you just basically subtract from the total bonuses that they have applied, which is to say he's got a 20% bonus that we know is applying. And again, remember, exclusives, as far as we know, don't apply on single target solo bases, but they do apply on forts. Okay, that you would end up taking 909 minus 20%, and basically what you end up getting, again, this calculation here is like if, let's say, I was sending a rally at a fort, you're going to get that calculation, but it is also a little different in that, you can see how I can get 741 compared to 572. This is where I'm in the realm of I'm not really sure what's going on here. Still kind of trying to decipher what's going on, but more or less what we do know is if, let's say, we send a report where, okay, say he's got a set of 3 legendary heroes and they're all maxed out. He's got hero gear, he's got chief gear, and all that jazz. You throw pretty much all of that together, right? And let's say for a minute that, you know what, I'm going to just backtrack a bit. Say I know he's got 909 on this one. I can just as easily look at a report that he sent where it's 696 because he doesn't have his fancy heroes on. Okay, and I've tried doing this a couple of times to try and figure out exactly how we got to 696 compared to 909, to try and figure out, well, how can we get to a true number? I mean, that ends up being 563.58 when you backtrack it. So when we look at it, right, a 741.08 to a 563.58, that's a pretty substantial jump in difference. But when you take into account their 30% rally troop attack bonus from the exclusives coming from me and Jero, it obviously closes that gap quite a bit. You go from, instead of 741, you're at 572 to 563. So I'm not so convinced yet that widgets aren't in some capacity applying even on someone's base, but I'm not yet sure of that either. I mean, for all I know, there may be another explanation why this 741 to 563, there may be 200% being differed here, in part because there are a couple of things that we don't know. That is to say, what is their initial troop attack, right? Because you do know that when you look at your core stats, because again, we're just looking at, like infantry attack in this case, right? What we don't know is so if, let's say, we attack somebody, all right, the stat I think that's throwing this off, and is part of the reason why there is such a ginormous difference between 741 and 563, is actually because of troop attack. And I honestly think when you take 741 and 563 and subtract the two, right, which is to say you take 741.08 minus 563.58, that 177.5 could just very well be our troop attack. I don't know that with any amount of certainty, though. And of course, you can compare against, say, like different unit types for their attack stat and see if you get a relatively similar number. And if you do, then perhaps that's what's going on there. But I have a feeling there's probably a couple of other stats here that aren't being accounted for. But let's, get to the bottom of the barrel, right? Which is to say that, okay, right now we're still kind of in the middle of learning this. There's kind of some, internal talks to try and figure out exactly how could we get to where this could be of value to us, right? Because it'd be nice to know if, let's say, when you're going up against somebody, what their original core stats are just by going off of a couple of reports you've saved. Like that's originally kind of the idea behind it, because then you know, oh, well, his buffs, when buffs are active, it's going to be this, but without buffs, it'll be this. That's the key. We're trying to figure that part of it out, and I think that ought to be very close or really close to what the answer actually is. But we're still working. I'm still working on trying to figure this part out, but I thought I'd go ahead and share what I've learned so far. Maybe somebody else out there can kind of piece together the next piece that I'm not really so sure about. Now, of course, the other bit of the report, right? And I'm going to show you just kind of for fun, because I think some people are kind of curious about this. You might have noticed the troop power comparison bar. And if you tap on this arrow here, it'll actually tell you the percentage to troop relation to your composition. I think it's a little misleading, though, because a lot of people assume that that is the total number of troops in relation to your total number of troops, and it's like, yes, it is. Like, this is the total number of troops in relation to what you have on that side, right? But when you're looking at the bar, you're actually looking at not only the tier, but you'll notice this says, you know, freaking level 9.9. Well, that 9.9 is actually taking into consideration of all the tiers of troops that you have in there. This is why when you look at your power, you really have to actually take the total number of troops per tier and multiply that by its power, and then compare that to their total number of power on the other side. And that's what these bars are. I'm pretty sure that's what this comparison is looking at. And so, like, I was doing the math on it, you know, just to kind of have fun with it, right? And this is, you know, I think, I believe this is the report that I had. But basically what it comes down to is that, you know, having 60,244 is exactly 5,252 power for each unit type. Now, in my case, I was looking at like where it was breaking through, which is to say I fended off a bunch of marches, and I was kind of curious as to like, why is it exactly that this one broke through, right? What was the breaking point here that actually kind of got it all screwed up, right? Because I think a lot of people would be kind of genuinely curious as to like, why would this have fallen and why did it break? Well, the thing is that at 11%, at 42 and 46, it makes kind of sense in the sense that, you know, you've only have 10%. Your infantry bar here is really close to the center. So it's like, okay, now I understand why it broke through. But the thing you might be thinking about is, okay, but what does that mean in terms of, you know, okay, you look at your report. You'll notice that it actually started dipping into Lancers a while ago. And so if we look at a couple of reports prior to this, I actually picked up one of the reports, and I noticed that it wasn't until this report that it actually, you know, started to dip. So after this report, so from this point forward, if you go to the next report after it, you'll notice that I actually started dipping into Lancers. Now, if you look at this particular report here, okay, and you look at the troop composition, you'll notice it's at 17.65%. Now, don't take this with a grain of salt by any means, right? But this guy's sending 60,244 or so troops to 193,598. Okay, the total I had at the time was 1.1 million or so troops, or it was pretty damn close to it, right? The main thing that we got to get out of this is that when we look at this, this is the point at which the Lancers are being dipped into, which is to say that that front line for infantry had actually weakened enough that his infantry started hitting my Lancers. And this is like kind of what I call a critical breaking point that I think is kind of important for a lot of you to learn from here, is because even though he has a statistical advantage, right, and there is still a substantial jump between here and there, like there's probably still some math here that can be done to kind of even quantify how many troops you're going to lose. We don't really know that specific yet. It would be nice to be able to tell you with any amount of certainty what's going to happen, but the reason why we can't do that is partly because of the skills that are being employed and the fact that some of this is kind of random and that how many times they trigger and what's going to trigger. Plus, I had reinforcements, which that throws a different factor into it, like how much of an influence, if any, do the defenders' reinforcements have on it. What I can tell you, okay, is if you are the person defending, and you're, say, defending in a rally as opposed to like somebody that's defending on their base. If you're defending on your base, the two things that seem to basically cause a garrison to collapse is A, they're going to need a lot of infantry. So if their infantry line collapses, then it goes after their lancers next. And naturally, they start losing a lot of troops pretty fast. And because they have lancers on the opponent's side, they're going to throw at marksmen, and that's going to lower their marksman count. So every solo march that an attacker goes after a player that's defending, his marksman and infantry counts are going to go down until eventually his marksman count is so low that the opponent's infantry line lives longer and therefore kills more troops as a result of it, and it just kind of snowballs. So if you want to help your friend, send infantry and marksmen. I would do a 50-50 blend of those two types, and don't worry about the lancers. Here's why. If you go up against somebody that's, okay, he has a lot of infantry and a lot of marksmen, then send them all lancers. Because then what you've done is you've pretty much created a situation in which the opponent then has to get through with their marksmen, but if their marksmen die too fast, then they're not going to be able to do really a whole lot of anything. Now, the problem is just because you increase the amount of lancers they have, you're not really doing any more damage, so to speak, because that's all driven by the stats calculation. So in a way, you end up really kind of finding yourself in a position where it makes more sense to actually send more infantry and more marksmen than it is ever to actually add more lancers, unless for some reason that guy's lancer count is low. And that's the only time where it ever becomes relevant. And that's why some people will just send equalize, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? But I point this out because I feel like whenever you go into fort battles, a lot of people, what they'll try to keep their fort equal. Of course, there are a couple of other things that I can get into as far as like joining rallies and such, and we'll get into it in a bit. But and it's more specifically like how the rules of it, how it works. But again, I'll explain that here in a bit. But like I said, I think if you lose about a third of the power of your infantry line, that seems to be about where the breaking point is. So that is to say, like, if you can take like the total number of troops you have, so in this case, let's say I just have 386, 214, and take 517, 046, and then 193, 598, right? And then I just take that large number of 1,096,858, right? If I did 183, 598 and divided it by that total, it's a little under, 17%. Of the total troop total, right? Which sounds about what we expected to hear earlier when we were looking at, our total in relation to what, I guess, like if you go into the battle details, right? And you look at what you lose in terms of troops, you can kind of see what I mean. Like now, I mean, the thing is I point this out because if you look at the report previous to it, okay, here he's at 286, 557, 396, which is 23%, 44.95%, and 31.96%. A little different result occurs here. Even though I have those amounts, you'll notice that my lancers, at no point did I lose any lancers. Okay? So I think that's significant. I mean, it's something that we should probably pay very close attention to, but I have a feeling that this rule of thumb is probably going to hold true if you're defending. And I mean, obviously, if you're not going to have a lot of infantry, and this is also relevant by tier, right? Like, just because I say that, oh yeah, okay, this works at 20%, right? The problem also becomes are they T10 or are they T9, T8, T7, T6, and so on? This is where this troop power comparison kind of gives you a better idea of what you're looking at, because it's going to vary depending on how many of those troops are actually T10, T8, T7, and so on, because the power, the attack, and so on is also going to be driven by the type of tier of troop that you have. And so you're not going to be able to be as effective with, say, like 500,000 T5s as you are 500,000 T10. And again, if you're wanting to get a more accurate answer as to like exactly how much stats difference is there, you just click on this here and it'll tell you. You know, like here, there's 83 power for every T10. If we compare that same unit, it's 16 power per tier 5. The problem is that, okay, if we're looking at the attack stat, or even the health stat, right, which is 8 and 13, compared to 13 and 18, it's a pretty substantial difference. Plus, you have to consider lethality, defense as well. You know, and so I think there's even the fact that, you know, well, it's also FC3, FC1, and so on. There's so many little itty bitty factors here that we don't have a lot of control over. One thing I did notice though is across the board, every single unit is like got a speed of 11, which I thought was kind of interesting. That doesn't change. It does not matter what unit type you have. It is all speed 11. That's something that's universal across the board. It doesn't matter if it's range, cav, it's all the same. So I don't know. I mean, I feel like if with that information though, I think you can probably build off of that, and there might be more to it there that you can actually learn from. That said though, given what I was telling you earlier, what I was going to say about the rallies and the joining aspect of it is, so like if you're going to send a rally, for example, let's say you just go rally a fort, and this is going back to the exclusive gear and the widgets, right? Because like I was saying earlier, it's still kind of like I can't like figure out if whether widgets are applying on people's bases or not. It looks to me like it is, but it very well may not be. It may not apply at all. I'm just trying to figure out where that answer is. But like if let's say I rally a fort or a player's base, right? What I'm getting at here is though, if you join the rally, that little flag that I've been telling you about, as a joiner, this is relevant for the first 4 people that join the rally. The first 4 people with that little flag, that hero skill is going to get applied. So if you're the person joining the rally and your little flagged hero is Molly, then what's going to happen is you're going to get this 20% stun chance hero that's going to join the rally. Now, that's okay, but that may not be what your guild wants, right? Because you may not want 4 people with stuns. Instead, you might want 4 people with a skill like Jesse, for example, where you get 25% increased damage dealt. You know, so if the first 4 people in your rally join that with this hero as their flagged hero, then that's the skill that's going to be brought to the rally. And then every person joining it from that point forward can either be defense heroes like Sergey, or they can be Patrick, or whatever else they have at hand. And it won't matter, okay? Because when you join a rally, the only first 4 heroes are the only ones that actually matter. Of course, you know, if you're the rally captain, something else you have to consider is, you know, okay, yes, exclusive gears do stack, at least on a rally. As far as we know, anyway, when you're hitting a fort. So, like, if you, say, send Mia and Geronimo at the same time, you're going to get 15% rally troop attack twice. So you're going to get 30% rather than just 15. And the only reason why that works is because you have Geronimo and you have Mia, and they're 2 different unit types. One's Lancer and one's Infantry. Obviously, you can't send 2 Infantry heroes at a time, and that's part of the reason why that works. You know, and so obviously there are different inverse relationships between the different heroes, but I guess something else that a lot of people don't really consider, and I think this is, you know, going back into the weeds of things a little bit, but, you know, I was looking at like kind of doing stat comparisons between these reports to kind of see if I could like make some kind of inference on why exactly it is that this broke through versus one. And I don't think there's an easy way to do it still. I mean, I've tried to see if I could find a way, but as of right now, it just doesn't. It's just not there. It's not easy to grasp, you know. But what we do know is that if you are disadvantaged in any way whatsoever, and somebody's 200 or 300% higher than you, they absolutely can't solo you out after a couple of marches. It takes maybe 3 or 4 times, but they can solo you out. The thing is, though, is if somebody's reinforcing you with like a couple 100,000 T10 infantry, and they just consistently do that, and then add in, you know, say, infantry and marksman, and just rinse repeat. Like, you could do this one of 2 ways, right? You could either have somebody send nothing but infantry, or nothing but marksman, but the premise is exactly the same. The idea would be to basically try to tire this guy out to the point where he can't continue sending solos because he's losing too many troops. And this assumes that the person that you're defending has relatively decent stats comparatively to the guy that they're being attacked by. But at the same token, if you get somebody that gets rallied, I'm sure the rules are going to change. If you get rallied by somebody compared to getting soloed by somebody, I think there are different rules being applied there too, because it doesn't seem like it's totally universal. And maybe that's the difference, is that maybe when you solo somebody, your exclusives don't apply because it's not a rally. But when you rally somebody, then your widgets do apply because it is a rally, and so then rally becomes, basically that goes into effect, and that might very well be the distinguishable difference between why a solo is maybe not so beneficial to the guy that's sending attacks to somebody rather than, say, sending a rally at somebody. Even though the rally does apply on castles, it's just that is, I think, probably what the difference is. And maybe that is actually, it may be the explanation that I was looking for earlier, is that is the difference. But, of course, comparing, for example, okay, so if you got more infantry attack than their lancer defense, something else that I thought about inversely, too, is you can also consider how much marksman attack do they have to your infantry defense. Like, these are things that effectively, whenever you're sitting here having to fight somebody, you want to try to basically improve the amount of infantry you have because it's your front line, and you want to basically make that front line live as long as possible, because all their lancers are going to want to do is knock down your marksmen so that you can't kill their infantry as quickly, and they want basically to do as much damage as they possibly can, to live as long as they can, to do as much damage as they can. Whereas the defender is really trying to increase his marksmen to kill off his opponent's infantry. And inversely, you could also just as easily increase the lancers to lower the amount of damage their marksmen are able to do because they die faster, and therefore, kind of a similar situation there, right? Now, of course, an attacker could just as easily increase the amount of lancers he has to try and offset that, but that's, I think, kind of the rule of thumb here as far as the stats are concerned, and also kind of like reading the reports. I think a lot of what I've told you so far, I think, as far as I can tell anyway, seems to hold water. Like, there's not a whole lot of murkiness to it as to what I've said. The only time where I've really found trouble is, let's say we're going to try and figure out what is this guy's original stats. It's not very easy because you can try to separate out, like, say, the infantry attack stat and separate, say, Geronimo's attack stats, which, by the way, is like about 260% infantry attack, right? If you took the core stat out of this and then 285% in this case from his chief gear, which would give you 170%, like, you separate all this out, and I've done the math and I've tried to separate it down to where it can make sense, and you're gonna find that, like me, you're gonna be off by 5 to 10%, and there may be an explanation for it, and it could be like, something simple, like maybe there's a fury bonus or something that's getting applied somewhere. The problem is I'll almost never be able to find it, and there's no easy way to look at it and tell off of a report just exactly what it was. I think it's something that maybe over time, maybe the developers can tweak it and make it in such a way that maybe it's easier to read. Because even right now, we don't really have an easy way to tell, like, what their troop attack is. We can tell what their infantry and their range and their lancers are, but we don't know what the actual troop bonus was that gave all of these stats the stats that they have. Because we know it gets tacked onto. That is to say, troop attack is like an all troop attack stat, so it applies to all of the attack stats across the board rather than just one or the other. And they probably just may have, just chose not to include it because that would just confuse you even further. But it would help to be able to kind of just, I guess, if you knew what that stat was, it's easier to go backwards, and then you could figure out what their original stat was, and then that would allow you to strategize between somebody that had the buff and not had the buff, or whether they were online with the buff or not. That's ultimately what that would do for you, but because there's no easy way to get to that answer, all we can kind of do is try to subtract the things that we do know, which is to say we can look at their heroes and subtract their heroes out of that equation, can subtract the widgets out of that equation. We can try to take out the hero gear. And then we can even compare, like with a completely different set of heroes and see if we get an even closer, amount. Given everything I told you. That is everything I know as far as reports and being able to read reports. It's about the only way to read them, as far as I know. But again, it's something I'm still actively trying to learn myself because it's not a very easy thing to do at a glance to know exactly where you are going to stand on a win or lose fight. And you just really typically won't know until you hit, and then you'll get a yes or no. And that's kind of troublesome, but it's like I can tell you, at least in general, right, with the troop power comparison, I think that's a really easy way of looking at this. But then, okay, well, now the composition, right, of a single march is going to vary. And this little tab here will actually give you a really good idea of just how well that makes a difference. Like here you can see 42, 45, and 12%. But what good does that do you when you have 444 units, 1,489 to 60,000? And this is where that troop power comparison becomes relatively important to understand. Because even though you could see earlier how, if I had more troops in this troop power regard, then he was not able to do as near as much damage as he was able to do when he obviously outranked my troop power, and then he even had the stat bonuses to, flack it on top. That's what makes the difference. But how much of a difference, it's hard to tell, but I can tell, like at this, it's 5 mil across, okay, for every march that he was sending. I believe the report I was looking at where I actually started mentioning these totals here, I believe that report was in reference to, it's not this one. I believe it would have been in reference to this one, more than likely. Because I was basically trying to, is that, no, it doesn't match. Because that number here, this number here should be the biggest number. And that Lancer troop power is not. So that would tell me that that's not the report. I'm not entirely sure now. Is it this one? Or maybe it was the report after that report that maybe. So, oh, no. Yeah, go back. Okay. As you can tell, I'm like kind of sporadic in that trying to find where my numbers went. Anyway, it's not that big of a deal, but that's ultimately how I was coming up to those conclusions. But hopefully with some luck, maybe this will make sense to you guys just by looking at these reports. I know it's not a definitive answer by any means, but I feel like we're still struggling to find a lot of this out on our own, really. In part because the developers don't really have an open access toolkit for us to know what is doing what exactly. But what we do know is that, it is possible for somebody with a lot of T10 to flatten the living hell out of you. And you might notice is, this says 2.6 for the average crystal fire level. And I thought that was kind of interesting because even though I have like a bunch of T10s or, that are all at T3, right? The fact that I had people joining the rally that were of lower tier was actually lowering that number. So I wonder how much of an influence does this have on your total losses. I will say that by having reinforcements, it definitely softened the blow. Because by having those infantry reinforcements and the marksman reinforcements in there, I didn't lose hardly any troops the first couple of marches. It wasn't until like the third to fourth march that I actually had some noticeable dips in my infantry range. Because at that point, the reinforcements were no longer there. But, needless to say, that is everything I know so far as reading reports go. Hopefully that was somewhat helpful and somewhat insightful for you, but it's still open to discussion, and it's one of those things that I believe White Bandit Y on the Whiteout Survival Discord will more than likely have more information, maybe even a guide by the time this is even posted. Because a lot of what I said today is more speculation right now than it is anything else. But a lot of what I know so far, that I know with some certainty is correct, is the troop power comparisons and the stat bonus comparisons in terms of what to look for in terms of the counter stats and knowing whether or not, what troop types are going to be where, and also which counter which. It's just once you start getting into the nitty gritty of what is that guy's original core stats are, that's when you lose people. We do know we know how to find the stat when you are going to attack somebody. We just don't know how to do the inverse of that to find out what their stats were from the beginning. That's still held on to as a bit of a secret. There's almost no way to know yet. But maybe one day that won't always be the case. But needless to say, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.